Part 3. The old bookseller led us through a narrow hallway, past rows of ancient tomes and forgotten manuscripts. The shop smelled of dust, ink, and something faintly metallic, like old coins. At the end of the hall, he unlocked a wooden door and motioned us inside. "This isn't just a bookstore," he said. "Not for those who know what they're looking for." The room beyond was small and dimly lit, cluttered with old files, scrolls, and a desk piled high with yellowed papers. A single lamp cast flickering shadows along the walls. Harry and I stepped inside hesitantly, our eyes darting over the strange collection of texts. The bookseller sat down behind the desk and pulled open a drawer, retrieving a small, tattered notebook. He placed it in front of us. "This belonged to a man named Albert Shaw," he said. "He lived in that house, and if the stories are true, he wasn't just a reclusive old man. He was something else." I opened the notebook carefully. The pages were filled with jagged, erratic handwriting. Strange symbols were sketched alongside notes written in a language I didn't recognize. But between the cryptic scribbles, I caught glimpses of English phrases. "The curse cannot be undone. The transformation is inevitable. Blood binds the cycle." My fingers tightened around the fragile paper. What was he researching? The bookseller leaned forward, lowering his voice. He wasn't just studying werewolves, he was trying to become one. A chill ran down my spine. Harry exhaled sharply. "You're saying he wanted this?" The old man nodded. "At least, that's what the records suggest. He believed he could control it, that he could shift between man and beast at will." I turned another page, my breath catching at a faded photograph tucked between the sheets. It was an old, black and white image of a man standing outside the very house we had explored. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his expression unreadable. "Did he succeed?" I asked. The bookseller's face was grim. "No one knows for sure. But what we do know is that one day, Albert Shaw vanished. Some say he died in the woods. Others believe he's still out there, living among the trees, waiting." The air in the room grew heavy. I thought of the shadowy figure in the house, the guttural growls, the way the air had felt charged with something unnatural. "What if he's not gone?" I murmured. The bookseller's eyes met mine. "Then you boys have a much bigger problem than just ghost stories." Harry shifted uncomfortably. "So what do we do?" The old man sighed. "You need to leave that place alone. Whatever you saw, whatever's still out there, it doesn't want to be disturbed." A long silence stretched between us, but I already knew. We weren't done with that house yet. And something told me neither was Albert Shaw. As we stepped out of the bookshop and onto the damp streets, Harry and I exchanged uneasy glances. The conversation with the old bookseller had left us with more questions than answers. The story he told about Albert Shaw mirrored what James Roderick had said almost word for word. We walked in silence for a while, the distant glow of streetlights barely illuminating the misty road ahead. Finally, Harry broke the silence. "Did you notice how similar their stories were?" he asked. I nodded. "Almost identical. It's like everyone in this town has the same version of events, like some kind of rehearsed legend." Harry exhaled sharply. "It's more than that. It's not just a story to them. It's as if the entire town is obsessed with that house, with Albert Shaw, with whatever he became. It's like they all know something and are just waiting for someone to put the pieces together." I thought about it for a moment. He was right. Every person we had spoken to, the old man at the pub, James Roderick, now the bookseller, had shared a version of the same tale. But there was something else beneath their words, something unspoken, lingering just beyond the surface. "It's almost like they live in its shadow," I murmured. "Like they can't escape the presence of that house. No matter how much time passes, it's always there. A stain on the town's history that refuses to fade." Harry kicked a loose stone on the pavement. "And yet, no one does anything about it. They don't try to tear the house down, don't try to prove or disprove the stories. They just let it sit there, like they're waiting for something." A cold breeze swept through the street, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. "We need to go back," I said finally. Harry stopped walking. "Back where?" I looked him in the eyes. "To the house." His jaw tensed. "Luis, you heard the bookseller. You heard Roderick. Whatever happened in that house, whatever's still there, it's not meant to be disturbed." "Then why does everyone keep talking about it?" I challenged. "Why does everyone seem so prepared to tell us exactly what they know?" They want us to believe it's dangerous, but they also keep feeding us more reasons to go back. It doesn't make sense. Harry hesitated, running a hand through his hair. He hated to admit it, but he saw it too. There was something strange about how the town spoke of the house, like it was a warning, but also an invitation. I continued, I need to know what's really going on, Harry. We both do. We're already too deep in this to walk away now. Harry let out a slow breath, shaking his head. This is a terrible idea. Maybe, I admitted, but it's the only way we'll get the truth. For a moment, he stared at the ground, considering. Then, finally, he sighed. Fine, but if something goes wrong, we leave immediately. No hesitation. I nodded, agreed. With that, we turned back toward the outskirts of town, toward the darkened road that would lead us once again to the house of Albert Shaw. This time, we wouldn't just be looking for clues. This time, we were ready for answers. Harry and Louis drove through the winding roads, the headlights of the car casting long shadows on the dense trees that crowded the sides of the road. The night air was crisp, with a biting chill settling in as they neared the edge of the forest. They parked as close as they could to the old house, the car's engine humming quietly before they turned it off. For a brief moment, they sat in silence, the weight of what they were about to do hanging in the air. Without a word, they both stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under their boots as they locked the doors. The scent of damp earth and the musty smell of the surrounding woods filled their lungs. The forest was darker than they remembered, the trees growing taller, their branches twisting above them like skeletal hands reaching out. They began to walk, the narrow trail barely visible beneath the thick undergrowth. The moonlight filtered through the leaves in faint streams, but the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. Their steps were slow, careful. Louis's breath was visible in the cold air as he glanced at Harry. Do you think the old bookshop owner mixed up the name? Louis asked quietly. Was it really Albert Shaw? I swear I've heard a different name before, like someone else. His voice trailed off, uncertainty creeping into his tone. Harry squinted ahead into the dense trees, feeling the same unease that Louis seemed to. I'm not sure, he replied, his voice low. It's possible, but at this point, does it matter? Whether his name was Albert or something else, it's the same house, the same strange stories. And it's all real, Louis? That's what matters. Louis exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the path ahead. Yeah, you're right. The name doesn't change anything. But it does make you wonder what's going on here. What's been hidden in this house for so long? The path was narrowing now, the trees closing in on either side. It felt as though the forest itself was watching them, but Harry didn't speak of it aloud. They had already been here twice before, and the sense of something waiting for them had only grown stronger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of walking in silence, the house appeared through the trees. The roof was barely visible, the silhouette sharp against the dark sky. The windows were pitch black, lifeless eyes staring back at them, as if the house itself were watching. The air around the building felt colder, the silence thicker, and even the moonlight seemed reluctant to touch it. Just as they were about to move closer, Louis stopped. His eyes flicked to the shadows near the house, where 3 figures stood, motionless. They were barely distinguishable in the low light, but it was clear they were human. 3 people standing together, too still, too silent. Harry slowed to a stop beside him, his gaze following Louis's. Who are they? He whispered. Louis shook his head, narrowing his eyes. I don't know, but they're just people, right? Probably locals, just walking around the house. Harry nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The 3 figures didn't seem to be walking or moving in any way, just standing. As they continued forward, the figures remained frozen in place, their features indistinguishable in the shadows. There was something strange about the way they stood, their presence adding to the unease that already clung to the air around the house. Harry's heart rate quickened, but he couldn't place why. He tried to focus on the house instead, the old structure towering over them, the windows dark and empty. The only sound now was the rustling of leaves underfoot as they made their way forward, the trees whispering secrets they weren't meant to hear. They both froze, the figures standing just out of reach, their silhouettes barely distinguishable in the flickering moonlight. Harry motioned to Louis, urging him to lie down. Without a word, they both crouched low and crawled carefully behind the thick trunks of nearby trees, pressing themselves into the cool earth. The sound of their breathing seemed too loud in the oppressive silence of the night. They stayed still, every muscle tense, watching the three figures through the spaces between the trees. The people, no more than a few yards away, had not moved, but the longer they watched, the more Harry felt an unease settle in his stomach. The figures weren't acting like normal people. They were standing motionless, almost in a way that reminded Harry of statues. The air around them felt heavier, and though the figures had not yet taken a step toward the house, Harry sensed something was about to happen. The strange stillness of the moment made it feel like time had frozen. Louis's voice was a soft whisper, barely audible against the stillness of the woods. "They're going to go in?" he murmured. "Do you think they know something about what's inside?" Harry didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on the figures. They were dressed in dark clothing, blending into the night, as if they belonged to the very shadows of the forest. For a moment, he thought he saw one of them turn slightly, as if acknowledging something in the distance, but he couldn't be sure. Then, with a sudden movement that sent a chill down their spines, the three figures began walking toward the house. It was deliberate, slow, and their movements seemed too calculated, too synchronized. They didn't speak, and there was no sign of hesitation. Their steps were almost ghostly, as if they knew exactly where they were going, and they didn't need to hurry. Louis's breath hitched. "They're heading inside." Harry felt a sharp pang of fear, but he didn't move. His eyes remained glued to the figures as they approached the porch of the house. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and the trees surrounding them swayed ever so slightly, as if moving in response to the figures' approach. The air felt thick, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The figures reached the door of the house, and Harry strained his eyes to catch any further movement. The door didn't open with a creak. No sound of footsteps echoed inside. It was as if the figures melted into the house, their presence swallowed by the dark building that loomed over them. There was no noise, no light, just the oppressive silence of the night. Louis shifted, his back pressing into the bark of the tree. "What now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Harry's gaze remained fixed on the house. "We wait." For what felt like an eternity, they remained in their positions, the tension mounting with every passing second. The figures had disappeared into the house, but neither Harry nor Louis could shake the feeling that something else had happened, something unexplainable. The house, once dark and seemingly lifeless, now felt like it was alive, breathing with a presence they couldn't quite understand. As the minutes passed, the wind rustled through the trees again, and the sounds of the forest crept back into the air. But the house remained still, almost like a watchful eye, waiting for something else to occur. A flicker of light broke the dark stillness. It was faint at first, barely noticeable through the thick curtains that hung in the windows, but then it grew brighter. Harry's heart skipped a beat. The light inside the house had turned on. The windows, which moments ago had seemed black and lifeless, now shimmered with the faint glow of light. Harry and Louis exchanged a glance, their faces pale in the dim moonlight. They barely dared to move, their eyes fixed on the house. The figures they had seen entering moments ago were now visible through the windows, their silhouettes illuminated by the soft glow from within. At first, they thought they might have been mistaken. The figures were standing still in the windows, just as they had in the yard, but now there was something unsettling about their stillness. It was as if they were not looking out, but waiting for something. Or someone. "Are they? Watching us?" Louis whispered, his voice trembling. His eyes widened as he tried to focus on the figures through the faint glow of the house. Harry didn't answer right away. His throat felt dry, and the unease gnawed at him. The figures were now clearly visible, standing in two of the windows, one in the front, one on the side. The third figure was nowhere to be seen, but Harry could feel that it was still there, somewhere. The air around them felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "They must know we're out here," Harry muttered, more to himself than to Louis. "They must be watching us." Louis swallowed hard and nodded. The figures remained motionless in the windows, unmoving as the light flickered and shifted, casting eerie shadows against the walls of the old house. The stillness was unbearable. Time seemed to stretch on indefinitely as they observed the figures. Each second felt like an eternity, their gazes locked on the illuminated windows, unable to tear themselves away. Harry's stomach churned with a growing sense of dread. The figures in the windows didn't seem human, not entirely. Their shapes were too stiff, their posture too rigid. "Why aren't they moving?" Louis murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Harry replied, his voice tinged with fear. "But I don't think we should stay out here much longer." But something about the situation held them there. They couldn't look away, couldn't tear their eyes from the glowing windows. The figures, those strange, still figures, had somehow drawn them in, holding them captive without a single word spoken. As the minutes passed, the light inside the house flickered once more, casting shadows in strange angles, and for a brief moment, Harry thought he saw the faintest movement, a subtle shift in the figure closest to the window. It was only for a moment, but it felt significant. The figure's head turned, almost imperceptibly, as if it was looking directly at them. Harry's breath caught in his throat. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure froze again, locked in place. The house seemed to grow darker once more, and the light inside faded until the windows were once again shrouded in blackness. "They saw us," Louis said, his voice barely a whisper. Harry's heart raced. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but everything in him screamed that they shouldn't wait around to find out. "Let's go," Harry urged. "Now." They both turned and, as quietly as possible, began to retreat into the woods. But as they moved, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that the house, the figures, and the eyes watching from the windows were all still there, staring, waiting. The drive back to the hotel felt like an eternity. The silence between Harry and Louis was heavy, the weight of the night's events hanging over them. As they pulled into the hotel parking lot on the outskirts of the town, neither of them said much. Their minds were still trapped in the house, in the shadows, and in the chilling presence they had witnessed. The hotel room was cold and uninviting, its flickering lights casting an eerie glow over the mismatched furniture. They didn't bother with the usual pleasantries of settling in. Instead, they both collapsed into chairs, exhausted and on edge. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. Louis sat near the window, staring out into the darkness, while Harry lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the figures, frozen in the windows, waiting. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. It was hard to tell. The darkness outside deepened, and the room became quieter still, save for the occasional rustling of trees outside. The fatigue from the long day began to settle in, and Harry could feel himself slipping into a restless sleep. But just as he was on the verge of drifting off, the shrill sound of the phone broke the silence. The ringtone echoed through the quiet room, jarring both of them awake. Harry groggily reached for the phone on the bedside table and answered it without looking at the screen. "Hello?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from the exhaustion and the tension of the night. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before a familiar voice spoke up, making Harry sit up straighter. "Harry, it's James Roderick." Harry's pulse quickened. It was the old man they had met on their first visit, the one who had warned them about the dangers of the house. James Roderick, who had seemed to know more about the place than anyone else in the town. "James, what's going on?" Harry asked, his voice shaky. "I've been thinking about your visit," James said, his voice gravelly and slow. "You've seen things, haven't you? I've been hearing strange things too. I know you've been back to that house, and I need to warn you. There's more to it than you understand. It's not over." Louis looked at Harry, his eyebrows raised in confusion, but Harry simply held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. "What do you mean it's not over?" Harry pressed, his mind racing with uncertainty. "We saw people, figures, standing in the windows. Who are they? What's going on with this house?" Another long pause stretched between them, the tension thickening. "You don't know the full story," James finally said. "There's something ancient tied to that place. Something dark. You've stirred something that should have been left alone. You need to be careful. Don't go back there without understanding what you're really dealing with." Harry's heart pounded in his chest. What do you mean? Something dark? What are you talking about? I'll explain more, but not over the phone, James replied quickly. I need to see you both again. Come back to town tomorrow. We'll talk then. But be ready. This isn't just a house. It's something far worse. Before Harry could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a long moment, the weight of James's words settling over him. Something dark. Something worse. The house, the people they had seen, and the bizarre connection to Albert Shaw. It was all connected, but Harry wasn't sure how. Lewis, still watching Harry, spoke up in a low voice. What did he say? Is it bad? Harry put the phone down on the bed. We need to go back. He knows more about all of this. I don't know how, but he's tied to it. We need to find out exactly what we're dealing with. Lewis nodded, though his expression was filled with uncertainty. Are you sure? This is getting strange, Harry? Stranger than I thought it would. Harry ran a hand through his hair. We don't have a choice now. We need to know everything we can. And James Roderick, he knows more than he's letting on. The room felt colder now, the oppressive silence almost suffocating. Whatever was happening in that house, whatever dark force was pulling them back, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The next step would be crucial, but Harry had the feeling that this time, they might be walking into something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. Harry and Louis arrived in the center of town, the air thick with the weight of everything they had uncovered. The streets were still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. They spotted James Roderick standing near an old bench, his posture tense, his face shadowed with unease. He looked different, more tired, more anxious than the last time they had seen him. As they approached, James gave them a weary nod. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he said, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty. We need to talk, Louis said. You called us. What happened? James let out a slow breath, reaching into the pocket of his worn coat. He pulled out an envelope, its edges yellowed with age, the ink slightly smudged. He held it up between his fingers. This, he said, arrived yesterday. After all these years. Harry narrowed his eyes. What is it? James hesitated before speaking, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. It's a letter from an old friend, the man who used to live in that house. Louis felt a chill run down his spine. You mean? James nodded. Yes, the man you've been chasing in all those stories, the one the town whispers about. He was my friend, once, and then he vanished. Harry exchanged a glance with Lewis before turning back to James. What does the letter say? James looked down at the envelope, as if still trying to convince himself it was real. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he unfolded the letter and began to read. James, if you're reading this, it means the house has been disturbed. That must not happen. I need you to make sure no one enters it. No one. The balance has already shifted once. Too much has been lost. If they go any further, there will be no turning back. Stop them before it's too late. He stopped reading and looked up, his expression grim. That's all. No explanation. No sign of where he's been all these years. Just a warning. Lewis exhaled sharply. After all this time, why now? James shook his head. I don't know, but one thing is certain. He knew someone would go back. Maybe he knew it would be you. The silence between them was heavy. The letter had raised more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Whoever that man had been, wherever he had gone, he was still watching, still aware, and he wanted the house left alone. But for Harry and Lewis, it was already too late for that. James Roderick folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into his coat pocket. He looked at Harry and Lewis with an intensity that hadn't been there before, his usual calm demeanor now laced with urgency. You need to leave, he said firmly. Harry frowned. Leave? James nodded. Go back home. Forget about this place. Forget about that house. Lewis crossed his arms. After everything we've seen? After everything we've learned? James let out a slow breath, his expression dark. You don't understand. That house, it doesn't want visitors. Whatever was awakened there, whatever force has been disturbed, it's beyond you and beyond me. Harry shook his head. You really expect us to walk away now after all this? After that letter? James's gaze hardened. Yes, that's exactly what I expect you to do. Louis scoffed. Why? Because some old friend of yours wrote a warning? Because of a few ghost stories? James stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because I know what happens to people who don't listen. I've seen it. Harry hesitated. What do you mean? James looked away for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. You think you're the first ones to go looking? You're not. There were others, decades ago. Young, curious men just like you. They wanted answers. They wanted to see if the stories were real. He looked back at them, his eyes filled with something close to fear. They were never seen again. A chill passed between them. Louis clenched his jaw. And you never told us this before? James exhaled sharply. Because I thought you'd have the sense to stop on your own. But you didn't. And now, I'm telling you, go home. Walk away while you still can. Harry and Louis exchanged an uneasy glance. James studied them for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter but no less urgent. You don't belong here anymore. Whatever is in that house, whatever has been waiting there for all these years, it's awake now. He shook his head, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Silence settled over them like a heavy fog. For the first time since their search began, doubt crept into Harry's mind. Maybe James was right. Maybe they had already gone too far. But was it really that simple? Could they just turn their backs on everything and walk away? Louis sighed, rubbing his temples. We'll think about it. James didn't look convinced, but he simply nodded. Do more than think, lads. Do what's right. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving them standing in the cold morning air, uncertain of what to do next. Harry and Louis sat in their car in silence, the weight of James Roderick's words settling heavily between them. The morning fog curled around the streets, giving the town an eerie, timeless feel. For the first time since they had started this search, they both felt something they hadn't before, a deep, unsettling finality. Louis exhaled and gripped the steering wheel. We're done, right? Harry hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, we're done. Without another word, Louis started the engine, and they drove away from the outskirts of town. Away from the abandoned house. Away from the stories that had consumed their thoughts for so long. As the miles passed and they reached the other side of the city, it felt like stepping back into reality. The people here didn't whisper about the old house. No one mentioned the name Albert Shaw. It was a different world, one untouched by the strange events they had experienced. For a while, they didn't talk about it. Life moved on. The mystery of the house faded into the back of their minds like a strange dream they had once shared. But years later, on a quiet evening, curiosity got the better of them. Louis, scrolling through his phone, decided to check Google Maps. He searched for the location of the house, expecting to see it marked, maybe listed as an abandoned property. But as he zoomed in on the area where the house should have been, all he saw was dense forest, no structure, no ruins, no trace that anything had ever stood there. He frowned and called Harry. Check the map. Look for the house. A few minutes later, Harry called back. It's not there. Louis leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Maybe they tore it down? Harry's voice was quiet. Or maybe it was never meant to be found again. Neither of them knew what to say after that. Perhaps some places aren't meant to be remembered. Perhaps some stories are never meant to be told, and maybe, just maybe, it was better that way. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.